Y'all, welcome back to Kentucky Fried Wargaming. We're two guys who are qualified to talk about anything besides talk about a game with hard math and chance. I'm Joe.
And I'm John.
And today we are continuing on our Conquest Lore deep dives in our best efforts. And today we're diving into the faction that John loves the most, which is a close race if I'm being honest, but I'm calling this one your favorite. It is the one that got you into the game first. The one that sort of snagged your attention immediately, and that's the Wadroon.
7 foot tall orcs riding dinosaurs, but they play like elves.
That's not wrong. Not wrong. But today we're going to try to stick mostly to the lore, and we're going to put a disclaimer at the top. Okay, there's so much lore for this faction. There's just a nutty amount of lore for this faction in a good way. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff in it. The problem is that like, it's just overflowed with nonsense. Like, it's all good. The hardest part was trying to figure out what we were going to try to put in this. And there's way too much to cram into one video. So after John has spent much time editing and a lot of back and forthing, we're going to probably have to do multiple videos on the Wadroon to get into some sub-factions, some cults, some units, some primes, in another video. So this one will be broad strokes. So forgive us before we even begin for how vague it's going to have to be.
And that's just, unfortunately, most of these factions. Like, there's a lot more under the surface, as some of the commenters have shown. There's a lot of stuff we don't cover. There's a lot of stuff that we don't even know, that we completely miss. And we're going back and finding stuff. So, we are not just going to make, one video about 100 Kingdoms forever. Like, we will talk about all this stuff over again. But this is sort of like the intro, I guess, like the origins of Wadroon up to how they became a society and then where they're currently at.
Yeah, it's a thing. And we're gonna give it our best crack. But if you really want to see all the stuff we messed up or all the stuff we left out, you can go to the comments, and Kang the Knight is probably gonna have all sorts of clarifying corrections down in there. And good lord, we appreciate him doing the good work, because we try to read all the articles and retain it all, but we just can't do.
Every time I find out I do things from a commenter, I go, yes, that's awesome. It's amazing.
I love this dynamic where we take our best crack and then everyone gives us constructive criticism in the comments and we get better. This is delightful.
It's like
Let's
English
not change.
all over again.
Yeah, this is great. This is much healthier than my previous internet experiences. So for the Wadroon, we start in Conquest, where we start with most every faction in Conquest, as we have come to show over almost all of them. We got to go back to the Spires, because in Conquest, the running joke is that every faction was either started by the Spires or the Old Dominion, and it holds true here.
Yep.
Wadroon only exists because of the Spire.
Yeah, so, the best surface level explanation of the origin story of them is that the exiles, who are known as the Spire in the game, in Abereth, I think that's how you pronounce it, were doing a bunch of experiments, trying to create new life, trying to create something new. The dragons long ago had made their own race, and the Spires wanted to do so, and they could not figure out how to do it. They could not figure out how to do it, so they're experimenting, until accidentally, with no ability to replicate it, they created 4 things called primes. And those primes are the originator of Wadroon, right? The spark of creation gets put into these 4 beings. And they are the 4 horsemen of war, famine, death, and conquest. Each of them embodying a different, part of the cosmology with, different, vibes. And, these are not just they're a little powerful. These are powerful entities. So powerful that the Spires have to put them into stasis and sort of keep them subdued, and then use their biological material to actually form the Wadroon. To create these 7 foot tall, massive, strong, built for war race, and not just for mindless combat. They are built to survive. They are given the skills and the abilities to deal with being self-sufficient.
Because the whole point wasn't that they were going to be I think the distinction here is that oftentimes for the Spires, people think of force-grown drones, where you die, you live, You maybe make it for a matter of hours, and then you die, and that's fine, because they just needed you for like one little battle, and then you're no longer useful. But for the Wadroon, they wanted a shock force that would kind of insulate them and could last for a campaign, not just a few battles.
Especially because their goal for them was to go back to their homeworld with the Wadroon as their vanguard force. Right, so they needed powerful soldiers. And you'll notice that with Spires, whenever they have a creation or a thing that they're manipulating, there's a distinct purpose, and this was that purpose. For Nords, it was, we need to defend ourselves over here, near the World Tree, and for Force-Grown drones, it's we just need cannon fodder, right? But all of that came at a cost, and it was a cost the Spires actually liked, and that is that they have an increased metabolism, like a significantly increased metabolism. They need a humongous amount of calories every day to survive. On top of that, they have a very short lifespan at about 40 years. They also grow to adolescence within 8 years. So, like, you come of age at 8 years old and you die by the time you're like 50. Like, you are known as an elderly Wadroon if you're 40.
I'm familiar with this lifespan, yes.
And so, like, this is interesting, and there's a bunch of unique intricacies about this period of time in the Wadroon War. But I think one of the more important things to know is that they all are tied somewhat to the primes. Just like, sort of, if you know 40K, Space Marines with the Primarchs, same thing, right? They are tied to them in some way. And two abilities appear. The ability to do magic, which Spires cannot do, and they're confused on how they made things that could do it. And two, an ability called speaking, or they become the speakers. This is shown much more later in their story, but it is also a unique ability that the Spires did not plan on giving them that just sort of happened, right? Which is interesting, and is kind of where we're going to go out with the dinosaur stuff later. We'll get there. But this keeps going well. They keep iterating on these like creatures time and time again. They make the Bred, which are these like hulking monstrosities that are like built to just be tough and punch stuff. They've got like the normal Bred, the normal Wadroon that are just like their foot soldiers. They've got some that are tougher, some that are like slender and like more agile.
Essentially, they're trying to make like different variants here, kind of like people getting different dog breeds for different purposes. A big Alaskan Malamute looks different than like a Belgian Malinois, looks different than a poodle. Very different goals in mind, trying to differentiate this species by tweaking things.
Yeah, but before they could finish these projects, before they could figure out how to recreate the primes, which is a thing they keep trying to figure out how they can recreate, because if you can make a whole army of them, wow. But they can't. And so, what happens is that the Dwegum ruin everything, but also save everything. It's great. The Dwegum do something unspeakable. They go to war with the Spires, and they do something that only before had dragons been able to do, and that is take one of the Spires and bring it crashing down.
For a moment, I was a little confused, because you're like, do something unspeakable, go to war with the Spires. I'm like, man, that's very speakable. The Nords talk about it all the time.
No, the Dwegum destroy a Spire. There's very few factions that are capable of doing it, the Dragons being one of them. Dwegum destroy a Spire. This causes a massive shake-up in Spire culture. Like, it terrifies, right? Because it's like the ones here in Abeloth are not very far from where this happens, and they know the Dwegum are coming for them next. The Dwegum are not done. So they freak out, and they take their creations, and they decide, okay, we can do it again. Like, we can do all of it again. We have the notes. We can figure it out. We're smart on this. We are more important to stay alive than these creatures. Leave them. Proceeds to leave the Wadroon. Like, leave all of the Wadroon to fight the Dwegum. And escape.
Which, I mean, terrible decision, but I kind of like that moment, though, for the Spires. It's a race that could be, I don't think they're actually immortal, but they're almost timeless. They can live for just an unfathomable amount of time. Most of their warfare involves them never actually being in physical danger. They will, like, avatar, pilot a body elsewhere that's deniable. Like, they are very rarely themselves under pressure or under threat of death. And
Yes.
now that they are, they just sort of freak. Like
Yeah, they lose their minds.
they aren't ready for that level of pressure.
Yeah.
And they make a call that will hurt them. And I love it.
Yeah. So they leave all these Vadrun. They're like, well, they'll die, but at least we'll escape. And this includes the now awoken primes, who are sentient and capable of thought. And they look at their fledgling race, the things that they have that are from there, like their children, essentially, and go, well, we can't just let them all die. What do we do? And like, there's not a lot of direct lore about this moment, but I imagine that it's very, very easy to assume that the four sort of get together and go, we cannot allow this to happen. What matters more than our survival is the survival of this race, the survival of our people. And then 3 of the primes, War, Famine, and Death, decide to go, we are going to take a small force and we are going to fight the Dweghom tooth and nail for as long as possible, while the rest of you ride away with conquest and escape into the wasteland, away from all of this, to try to create a new civilization, to try to create a new life, to try to do something outside of this like nightmare that we've been fighting in. So they do. They escape, a whole bunch of them. There's a huge battle, but none of the primes live except for Conquest, who's known now as the living goddess, and I'm going to butcher this name, Ukasvane?
You gave it your best. I
Yeah.
cannot help you. I went to Kentucky public schools. Like I would give it our damnedest. But yet she's the only one who makes it out, which seems cool. Like, yeah, they made it. But here's where the calorie deficiency problem comes up, because you're in a wasteland.
Yeah,
that is essentially an arid desert biome with very little land suitable for agriculture in large scale.
Not only that, but they were not taught how to do agriculture. They don't know how to farm. They don't know how to gather. They don't know how to do any of that. They have spent most of their life learning how to fight wars, right? Similar to like the clones from Star Wars. Like there's like, what do we do if we're not fighting?
Mm-hmm.
And so they escape the Spires and the Dweghom, and now we're out in the wilderness, and they realize, oh, we can't. Our metabolism's killing us. Like, what do we do? And like the goddess is like, what do we do? Like, I can't. My people are starving to death. We have to figure out something.
You can't hunt nearly enough like birds and lizards to make this work. Not on scale.
They, in a twist of fate, have the physicality to survive the harshness of the wastes, right? Being so strong, being so tall, yada, yada, yada. But what they don't have is the calories to continue just existing because they're constantly hungry. And though, managed to like pull some grit and figure it out and find some way to survive. And they find these like little oases, right? And this gets a little muddy here on like, what happens when, because the fall happens. And what we really know is that the fall happens and the Wadrun that survive are able to survive in these small oases and these small little pockets in these desperate tribes. They are no longer unified. They are shattered all across the wastes. And they're sort of like just scraping by in small ways. And in the wake of this tragedy, after losing so much and just not knowing what to do, the living goddess makes a really tough call and walks away and goes westward towards where we now know is the 100 Kingdoms, across the clandestine mountains. And then will spend decades learning everything that she can to try to give to her people, to try to create, to save them, to build a civilization with what she can. Knowing that they will find a way to survive and she can help them rebuild when she returns.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move to relatively about 100, 200 years from modern Aya, right? And that is when she returns. It's a little wobbly on the time. Not sure, right? She returns and finds that her people now aren't just shattered, aren't just all over the place. They're fighting one another. They're warring with each other for the very little resources that are left, right? They're outright just tribal conflict between each of the tribes. She's done with it. None. No more of it. Often she is seeing some of the tribes finding these oases and coming and wiping them clean and then moving on, then warring with someone and then going to another oasis, wiping it clean, moving on. And sees this as wasteful, sees this as like the worst way of doing this. And so she proceeds to start collecting all the tribes, unifying the tribes, forcing, like fighting them if she has to, talking to the ones she can, and getting them to work together. And over time, teaches them everything they need to know to start building a civilization. They give them a language, right? She gives them the ability to like farm, to create medicine, to take care of each other, to have a society. It does this in lots of different ways. It's not just like, I taught you how to farm, and now you're just like all hunky-dory.
No, John. She only handed them Stardew Valley. That's it. It's that easy. Boom.
Yeah. No, she also proceeds to take aspects of society and build it whole cloth to match the Woodrune culture. So, like to start off with, before we get into the cults, there's a thing called being bound, right? So in Woodrune society, when you hit 8 years old, you are given a trial, and in that trial, you're chosen to either become a warrior, right, to become like a brave, join one of the cults, and do whatever that cult does, right? Or you are bound to your tribe. And if you're bound to your tribe, your job is to now be a farmer. The vast majority of Woodrune are bound, even though they are all raised from a young age to be prepared for war and to fight and to do things that need to be done. Most of them are bound and do farming. And this is also used as like punishment. It's also used as like 1,000 other things. But it's not negative in their society, right? This does not make you lesser. This is not like slavery, right? What this is your contribution is a pragmatic decision that all Woodrune make for the survival of the race, right? Because they need so much calories, they need so much food, that if whatever you're doing isn't good enough to warrant the calories you're taking out, then you need to find a way to be useful.
Mm-hmm. It's sort of like a brutal meritocracy,
Yes.
which has a lot of societal implications, and I'm sure a lot of ramifications and discontent. But given the situation, I could see the logic.
Yeah,
and especially when you need this much food, like in that environment, it's tough to falter for trying to make it happen culturally.
And I think what helps ease it over between like the warrior caste almost and like the farming caste that essentially exists here is like the cults are in between them, right? And the cults make up conquest, famine, death, war. And we'll talk about them briefly, but I'm not going to go into super detail about them. Essentially, like war are like the blacksmiths, and they forge metal. They make metal. That's their thing. They're the only ones allowed to touch metal. They're the only ones allowed to be blacksmiths. It's their gift. It's the thing they work through. Famine are the storytellers. They collect all of the culture that Woodrune is slowly building over time and share it between the tribes and share it amongst each other, which is fascinating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have death, right? Death is extremely unique in that it is not normal. Like it is not. They revere death. They accept death, but in a way that is not, oh, we want to cause death or we want death energy. No, it is in a way that they accept death as an inevitability. It is a thing that will happen, but it is their job to fight it till their last breath. And so this is where you get their medicine. This is where you get their surgeons. This is where you get their like healers and the people who take care of other people.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
The sort of like budding herbalist medicine that they're starting to develop.
Yes. And then you have Conquest, which is sort of like the head of the cults, right? For most of the Conquest members, they're forced to actually live through most of Woodrune society. They have to take part in every role to understand what it's like, so that they can be slowly built up to become leaders, to become like the ones that need to make the decisions, which is ultimately the purpose of the Cult of Conquest, is to make decisions.
Because how are you going to make great decisions for everybody if you can't understand their perspectives? Like,
But that brings us to like how their government works is essentially that the Ukfane, the living goddess, has said, and it's seen in Wadrun, that whenever they resort to individualistic monolithic power, it goes poorly for them, right? One person takes a bunch of power, starts killing a bunch of Wadrun, a bunch of people starve to death. Doesn't work. So everything is ran via councils, right? So everything is decided via councils and matriarchal queens that she puts in charge, right? It's a matriarchal society. But the vast majority of decisions are made collectively amongst a council that is of the different cults. And you notice there's 4 of them, and then the tiebreaker is done by something called the elders, in which the elders will, like anyone 40 or older in Wadrun, are the tiebreakers. That's their job in society. They're so old, their job is to use their wisdom to push forward. So you can see where like everyone has a purpose in different parts of their life within Wadrun society that allows them to sort of weather this long span of time that they're going to need to survive for. Because like when you talk about like 100 years for Old Dominion, that's nothing to a skeleton.
Mm-hmm.
But that's almost 3 Wadrun lifetimes.
Yeah. I mean, that's almost 3 Wadrun generations.
Yeah.
Entire generations.
So they like all of their spoken word culture has to go fast. So like much like their metabolism, their culture is expanding rapidly over time. But there's another unique thing about the Wadrun that I talked about earlier, and that was the speakers, right?
Mm-hmm.
The speakers have this special power that allows them to speak with creatures that were locked away in the Spire vaults. Some of them were like ancient creatures of Ea from times gone by. Some of them were like weird experiments that were being worked on by like the exiles. But like certain Wadrun were born with the ability to speak. Like it's a gift to speak to these animals and form connections and bonds with them. And that's how in the game we have like 7-foot-tall orc muscle mummies riding velociraptors.
To put it so eloquently.
Yes. But that is, that's like, because biologically, female Wadrun, they can only connect with carnivores. Male Wadrun can only connect with herbivores. We don't know why. They haven't explained it in the lore yet. If they did, and I just don't know where it's at, just tell me. But, like,
Kang, please.
Why. Yeah.
We actually tried to find that specifically, just out of curiosity. Just to see. It's an interesting lore tidbit. I like it a lot. I want to know more.
Yeah. And like this all sort of combines together to make a group, like a society that is built on like on things you don't normally see in war games, right? Like the entirety of the faction, like it is orcs riding dinosaurs, and you expect them to just be like like Kong Skull Island all the way down, but they're not.
I mean, I would kind of be here for Kong Skull Island all the way down, but that's fine. That's fine.
They're like a collective, pragmatic race that just sort of does what they can to survive.
Mm-hmm.
But that sort of like sets them up for where they're at as modern events start to occur, right?
Well, and I also think the interesting thing for me is that like one of the things they considered necessary to survive was the cult of famine, whose job is to remember their stories.
Yes.
Which, again, another take doesn't pop up in war games a lot. I like it. I think it's true. I agree with their living goddess. It was one that caught my eye when looking at the cults.
That and like the fact that they openly state that the vast majority of Wadrun, though they could all be combative and they could be this massive horde of orcs taking over Ea, can't, because they have to dedicate like something like 3/4 of their population to farming to survive, because they live in these oases that are like these locked parts of the wasteland that have palm trees and farming and like animals, and like they're still fighting for survival in there because there's creatures there. It's like, wow.
And the undead are pushing in, like the undead are pushing from one direction. You're dealing with Dwegum from time to time from below you. Who knows what's coming in from the west with some 100 Kingdoms exploratory force. The Nords are coming in from the north. Like, it's a dangerous time. And you would think that that would make just like a pure warrior culture, but then again, a warrior culture don't mean jack shit if you all starve to death before you ever get to a battlefield.
Yes.
So,
And so
an interesting set of circumstances for the faction.
And so we come to modern setting, right?
Yeah.
You sort of alluded to it about the undead coming. So we've talked about the Old Dominion. We've talked about how the Old Dominion have started to rise again and sort of branch out. And come to find out that where the Wadroon have their oases, where they have found these cultivatable land areas where they can grow mass amounts of crops and survive and grow food, is actually a former part of the Old Dominion that was super good farmland. And a lot of the Old Dominion's starting to come back for it as mindless undead, for reasons we don't fully know yet, have started invading this area. And slowly over time, the death magic itself is causing miscarriages for the animals. It's causing crops to start withering and dying. It's causing worse and worse yields from said crops. It's causing sickness that they can't really describe. It's causing all sorts of problems, right? Just as things are slowly dying. As this undeath is now starting to sweep across the land. And the living goddess sort of freaks out about this. And it's just what do we do?
Well, because now you're you finally get a bread basket to survive on that you could rely on for cultural growth. Now it's in danger pretty much immediately. That's an almost existential threat for this faction.
So what she lands on deciding to do is to split the Wadroon and have a lot of the Wadroon do what she did, and that is go west. And she sends a ton of the tribes together with, I'm pretty sure the character is referenced as her hummingbird of conquest.
Another thing we can't get super into.
Yes. Is sent westward. And there's a very cool short story about how this whole force goes westward to the clandestine mountains and crosses through and meets some Order of the Sword guy, and they meet with a bunch of people in Rismark, and they've got this cool thing where they help 100 Kingdoms dudes fight Nords and Dwegum and Spires, but the moral of the story is that the Wadroon that make it westward are alive, right? A lot of them. Many of them die in the wasteland on the way there, but enough live that exist out in that side of the world. So when you're playing the game, you can actually have a reason to be fighting 100 Kingdoms on their land and stuff. But it's done in a unique and fun way. But also, there's another interesting story that has happened. That is, that some of the ones that went westward instead went northwest. They broke off. They went to their own area. And they met Nords.
Hell yeah, they did. Ooh, one of the best Living World stories that's going on right now. John and I have said since we got into this game and first started to learn the lore, just little bits by bits, man, this faction just wants to pay rent, and this faction's hungry. What if through the power of struggles, they could maybe become buds?
They become roommates. Imagine Nords and Wadroon roommates.
Could we become pals and maybe just struggle less? And by God, the answer is maybe. It's happening. Yeah, we get a Living World story that is still going on. So we cannot talk about how this is going to end because we don't know yet. It's still happening. But the long and short of it is that you get to see from the perspective of a Cult of War member who is having weird dreams when they're sleeping about this metal tomb that is sort of infiltrating their mind that they don't understand. They know it's of Dwegum origin, but they don't know what. And they know that they need to go investigate it. And when they go to do so, they, again, find that it's of Dwegum origin and that they aren't the only ones there. They find Dwegum in the mountain passes coming towards it, which could be a threat to them and their small warband, because Dwegum aren't known for their open diplomatic disposition when meeting outsiders.
Pretty true.
And as they regroup to try to defend that, they also come across a bunch of Nords who are sometimes not known for their open diplomatic dispositions when meeting outsiders, which makes for a tense standoff. And where we are at currently, the Wadroon and the Nords have come to a tentative, temporary alliance of sorts to work together to try to repel a potential Dwegum invasion force that is going to come try to ruin them both. That they will fight side by side so that they don't just get turned to slag by these angry dwarves. And again, this is a great example of the Radrune no longer just being isolated in their wastelands or in their oases. They're starting to meet members of these other factions. Now, first the 100 Kingdoms, now the Nords, they're meeting some Dwegum. They're starting to make inroads with other factions and characters to become movers and shakers in a setting, feeling, more alive and like they are there.
Yeah, and I think that some things that we can look at towards the future for Wadroon is things like Sorcerer Kings, right? The Sorcerer Kings are coming from the southeast, and so they will end up in the wastelands more than likely interacting with the Wadroon. The Sorcerer Kings don't like the 100 Kingdoms. Right now, the Wadroon don't either. Do they make an alliance to fight the old Dominion together? They might. I know what I would do if I was Wadroon.
Could you maybe try to make an alliance with the Sorcerer Kings, who are elemental masters, to try to bring more rain, to give you more crops? Maybe. I would ask if I was a bound Wadroon person trying to make a deal. Could be potentially interesting. Or maybe they're going to go out and try to find alliances with other forces to push back the Old Dominion, who are kind of not just stepping on their front doorstep, but a lot of people's front doorstep currently, as the Old Dominion pushes out. It could be a pressure that could allow them to make some more long-term allies. An outside force is a great way to make friends with your neighbors in such a case.
Yeah, so currently the Wadroon they're set up in a situation where they are these plucky survivalists with the world out to kill them, and they have even their own bodies and physiology is fighting against them and causing them to suffer and die and deal with undue suffering, which makes them a very unique force in a wargaming, especially for orcs. Normally orcs are just ooh, we fight. They have this unique edge to them that is different, and what is useful for them narratively is that they have all of the gifts that they need to survive. They just have to shore up their weaknesses, right? And some of the other factions might be underestimating them, which would give them quite the ability to start gaining strength.
Yeah, and I would say they are a faction that is that is primed not just to get in physical conflicts and do really well and surprise people, but also diplomatically. They seem simple. They are very much not. Yeah,
they're very intelligent.
And they will use that cunning to negotiate. You see it in the living world. So for me, I think the Wadroon are going to have a really bright future. There's questions we have unanswered about the other primes, about the cults, if there's any way to sort of recreate those, or maybe if we can sort of fill that hole. There's stuff that I'm sure will unfold long-term with their story. And I'm much like when we kind of got done with the 100 Kingdoms, and a lot of the stuff was, I can't wait to see how this shakes out. I have that same feeling for the Wadroon, particularly with the cults and their sub-factions, and who kind of vibes with who in the world of Aya.
Yeah.
And for us, this is the highest level summary that we could get of this faction. It's over 30 minutes long. And you've probably heard us about 5 or 6 times during this episode say, we can't talk about that, we have to keep going. Or, we'll talk about this very lightly, but we have to keep going. So there's a lot left on the cutting room floor. And if y'all want to hear that, please put it in the comments below. The stuff that people request, we generally try to pull right to the top of the pile. So if there's anything you want to hear more of, any suggestions you have, or corrections of stuff we missed, some cool stuff that we should bring up later, we'd very much appreciate it. We'll be working on more videos over here and some more Conquest in the near future. Maybe even a new Conquest series. It'll be...
spoiling it on the show.
Coming along. For now, that's been all of our opinions. Bona fide and Kentucky Fried. We'll see y'all in the next one.